This evening, we are again discussing a question that was presented by you, by one of you, to me for this session, and it's again one that puts me on the spot, in that there are some delicate issues that inevitably come to the fore in addressing this question. And as you know, as I've stated in the past, I respect you too much to give you reductionist, simplistic, superficial answers. So, as we shall see, we have a lot to discuss. Without any further ado, let's begin by reading the question. Of course, again, on that basis, we launch into our discussion. The question reads, it seems shocking that Jewish sources relate similarly to Christianity and Islam. You said that rabbinical sources see both Christians and Muslims as acquainting the world with the one God. But Christians wonder, is this the same God we revere? Now, indeed, I plead guilty in that we did have occasion to discuss rabbinical sources that speak of both Christianity and Islam. I think it's important for us to begin from there in considering what the sources are saying, what the basis of it is, and what it means. So, as our starting point then, what I noted, I believe, a couple of sessions ago in our Ask the Rabbis sessions, is two of the foremost works of classic rabbinical scholarship indeed relate to both Christianity and Islam, and the two works relate to them both fairly similarly. Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, in his masterpiece of Jewish thought, the Crusade, and Rabbi Moses Maimonides, in his Code of Jewish Law, make the following statement in some variation, but the essential message is the same, that God ordained Christianity and Islam as the means to disseminate belief in one God, to bring the entire world to knowing about God. Now, of course, on the broadest of planes, the statement was intended to be accommodating and, in a way, inclusive, recognizing that from the perspective of these classic Jewish sources, Christianity and Islam have an important role to play in the development of the world and its advance in returning home to God. Just to place these sources in a historical context, and I'd like to return to this historical context a little bit later. Both hail from the 12th century. Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi's The Crusade was composed roughly around 1140. Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law around 40 years later, which I might note prompts an interesting discussion among later scholars, and that is, with the distance of 40 years, was Maimonides in fact echoing an idea that he might have seen even directly in the earlier book, the Crusade? A tantalizing possibility. I'm mentioning this because, of course, we need to bear in mind We're speaking about roughly 300 years before the printing press was introduced to Europe. So a span of 40 years might sound like a lot, but it really isn't, especially since for most of Maimonides' life, he lived in a significantly different part of the world from Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi. And I'm noting this because it is certainly plausible, arguably likely, that the two authors articulated the same thesis independently. And the reason I consider that an important enough observation to insert it parenthetically in our discussion is because if these two preeminent authors both independently articulated the thought, it may well imply that this was an idea that was, as it were, making the rounds, that was popular in rabbinical scholarly circles in relating to Christianity and Islam. That this is happening in the 12th century is, I think, especially significant. But why I think that's especially significant is something that I'm deferring until later this evening. I'm merely noting this for now because, of course, that does lead to the conclusion, guilty as charged, that rabbinical sources see both Christians and Muslims as acquainting the world with the one God. Of course, that does not entirely mean that Judaism would view Christianity and Islam as identical with one another. Because, of course, inevitably, we recognize that this is a complex and multifaceted issue. To express the point of divergence from a Jewish perspective between Christianity and Islam most directly, inevitably, we consider this book, the Bible. Obviously, the Bible is something that unites Christians and Jews. It is not something that we share with Muslims. Now, when I say the Bible, of course, I'm referring to that which we share, what Christians describe as the Old Testament and Jews describe simply as the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. I remember a couple of years ago, I was speaking to a group of Christian young people who were visiting in Israel together with Hank Benedike, and when I made the point about our sharing the Bible, he commented, but our Bible is bigger. Of course, that's not to imply that we don't have a voluminous amount of additional literature that is sacred to us as well. My point, as I expressed it immediately after his comment, was that may be so, but on the Hebrew Bible, again, what Christians will call the Old Testament, we all agree. To us all, it is sacred. And of course, noting that is especially germane here and now, because inevitably, it is upon that basis that we're meeting together. I very keenly sense, whenever we meet, that we're meeting on a common platform that is the Bible. Even when I'm not directly speaking about verses from the Bible, and I admit I'm not at the moment. I hope to get to the Bible a little bit later this evening, but nonetheless, that certainly is something that we share. And I'm emphasizing the point because, as you undoubtedly know, that is not something that Jews or Christians share with Muslims. Muslims revere their holy book, the Quran. It is, as any Muslim would readily agree, largely based upon the Bible, but as a principle of classic Muslim theology, they believe the Bible was changed, corrupted, what have you. And as a result, they do not revere the Bible. This is something that joins Jews and Christians, and of course, joins neither of us as Muslims. And it has practical ramifications. I mentioned just a few moments ago Rabbi Moses Maimonides and his comment in his Code of Jewish Law. Rabbi Moses Maimonides was asked, in rabbinical literature, we have a voluminous amount of responsa literature, questions that were asked to the foremost rabbinical scholars of the generation, to which they responded. And when he was asked about teaching the Torah to non-Jews, he drew an important distinction between teaching Christians and teaching Muslims. And given my comments of the last couple of minutes, you can probably anticipate what the distinction was. That is, Rabbi Moses Maimonides ruled that teaching Scripture to Christians is unequivocally permissible. Simultaneously, he ruled that it is not permissible to do so to Muslims. Why not? He goes on to explain that inasmuch as Christians revere the Bible, they will never take something they have learned of the Bible from us and pervert it as a weapon to use against the Bible. Because to Christians, the Bible is sacred. So they would never take any lesson about the Bible to use as ammunition against the Bible. Whereas Muslims might. Certainly in the time that Maimonides was writing, remember, we're speaking of a period in which the conflict between, in particular, Christendom and Islam was global in scope and very violent in intensity, and polemics concerning faith, concerning, for example, our reference to the Bible, were everyday affairs. So, as a matter of the most obvious practicality, one needed to bear in mind that if one's words or one's actions would be providing ammunition that could be used against the Word of God, against the Bible, one needed to exercise caution. So I am sharing with you, especially in the wake of my observation that Maimonides is one of the principal sources that speaks of Christianity and Islam, if you will, in one breath, so far as the dissemination throughout the world of belief in one God. Same author, who does draw the distinction that, of course, Christians believe in the sanctity of the Bible. And that's something that they share with Jews. And Muslims, of course, do not. So, of course, it is important to bear in mind that when analogies are drawn, they aren't necessarily absolute. And parallels in instances such as this, like classic parallel lines, never really meet. So yes, there is a parity established between Christianity and Islam in this regard as means for acquainting the world with the one God. But that doesn't mean that the attitude towards Christianity and Islam is necessarily the same in all of its aspects, in its manifold ramifications. But of course, that doesn't really strike at the essence of the question here. The question, there are, after all, theological differences. And as the question expressed it, Christians wonder, is this the same God we revere? I must note in this regard that in issues of theology, there is, I suspect, a fundamental matter of attitude in which Jews and Christians tend to view things from somewhat differing perspectives. That is, I'm aware, and undoubtedly you are far more aware than I, that in Christianity, many of the distinctions that separate the various denominations of Christianity are distinctions that are based purely on theology, even on relatively subtle matters of theology. Whereas, from the perspective of Judaism, theology, with all due respect, doesn't carry a whole lot of weight. Now, I need to explain what I mean by that. Obviously, there are essential principles of theology that are essential in Judaism. No question about it. There are, after all, foundational beliefs. And yet, simultaneously, Judaism classically has never really gotten especially worked up over theological subtleties, because for Judaism, what always occupies center stage is not what you think, but what you do. This is an idea that is deeply rooted in our outlook, going all the way back to Sinai. That is, when one considers the content of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments at Sinai, it would be, of course, incorrect to say there was no theology expressed there. Well, there was. That is the opening line of the Decalogue. I am God your Lord, who brought you forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. That is, after all, a theological statement. It doesn't have any practical ramifications. It's something you're supposed to believe, not something you're supposed to do. But, first of all, appreciate that as theological statements go, that's pretty concrete. Speaking about sensing God in history, not by any means abstract theology. And the distinction drawn here is, I think, a critical one. That is, matters of abstract theology don't even get onto the radar screen. It's a matter of concrete reality. Not so much what the subtleties are pertaining to what we believe, but how God is revealed, is manifest in this world. So yes, to that extent, the theology works itself in. That's the first observation, of course, with respect to that theological statement at the beginning of the Decalogue. The second observation to make, of course, is it's the only statement of its kind. That is, what comes next, indeed, the balance of the Decalogue is all either what you're supposed to do or what you are prohibited from doing. It's all action, all deeds. Deeds reign supreme. Of course, broadening further from the Ten Commandments, the 10 utterances, to the 5 books of Moses generally. The 5 books of Moses, altogether, are all about action. What you do. Again, I'm not going to deny there are certainly theological statements, quite literally from the word go, the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That sounds theological, and yet still, overwhelmingly practical. The actions. Because, inevitably, actions speak far, far louder than words. So, of course, to that extent, then, you can readily appreciate that when we view not only our own lives, but the world at large in terms of action, such questions that pertain to subtleties of theology inevitably end up taking the back seat. And I must note, if you ask, why is that so? My response very simply would be, God, as it were, reveals to us in the Torah his agenda. His agenda is nothing less, of course, than perfecting this world and enlisting humanity in following God's commands, the instructions he gives us as a user's manual for life, to do our utmost in accordance with his will to advance the world to that blessed goal of perfection. Well, how do we advance the world to perfection? Granted, what we think, how we refine our thoughts is relevant. It's relevant, but marginally so. What is most relevant is what you do. How by your actions you perfect the world. How by your deeds you bring closer that goal that we as Jews articulate at least 3 times daily at the end of our prayer services, to perfect the world under the reign of the Almighty. Perfecting the world is all about action. Now, obviously placed in this context, you can readily anticipate, because we've discussed it in the past, what the implications are going to be with respect to not just Jews whose lives are first and foremost defined and delimited by deeds, by divine commands, but also the rest of the world, the non-Jewish world. As we've discussed on more than one occasion, the key principle that is relevant here is God's covenant with Noah, progenitor of all of humanity, and the 7 Noahide laws that in our tradition are the basis of that upright living for all the world. Well, I'm sure you already remember what those commandments are, since we have, after all, discussed it in the past, but review never heard. The 7 Noahide laws: a prohibition on murder, a prohibition on idolatry, where idolatry means deifying what is not divine. A prohibition on sexual immorality, sexual licentiousness, a prohibition on stealing, a prohibition on blasphemy, which means cursing God in God's name, a prohibition on the wanton cruelty to animals that is manifest in tearing a limb of a living animal, or taking the blood of a living animal and eating it. Those are 6 prohibitions, and the 7th, establishing courts to enforce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These are the Noahide laws. Again, all about what you do. I grant there are principles here that have theological implications. A prohibition on idolatry and a prohibition on blasphemy. I just want to stress here that the prohibition on idolatry is, as I've noted, deifying what is not divine. It isn't at all clear that there is any positive mandate to believe in God. Just don't deify anything else. And likewise, the prohibition on blasphemy. It's a prohibition on cursing God in God's name. If you don't believe in God, then don't use his name to curse. If you do, you should be cursing him. It's an absurdity to curse God in God's name. So these are the Noahide laws, and they, as you already know, represent from the perspective of Judaism, the baseline of action that is expected of all humanity. And having said that, I feel obliged to add an important additional thought, at the very least parenthetically, because I realize speaking merely about the Noahide laws to you might be misconstrued as a veritable insult. Why an insult? Well, simply because to the extent that I fully appreciate you're not looking at life merely in terms of discharging the obligations of the Noahide laws, to make it sound like it's all about the Noahide laws and nothing else, I realize may even come out sounding demeaning to you. So, to clarify this point, I feel obliged to remind you of a story I think I have shared with you already more than once, so brace yourselves because I'm going to do it again. A conversation that I had last year during the weekend of the International Forum of Christians for Israel International with my dear friend Karl van Oort, the founder of Christians for Israel, who on Shabbat afternoon cornered me with a question and said, why are you guys always talking about the 7 Noahide laws? I taught my children the 10 Commandments. And I remind you, I replied to Karl on 2 planes, and I think both of these planes are important to bear in mind here. One plane is simply recognizing the universality of the Noahide laws. They apply to everyone. What I said to Karl was, of course, you taught your children about the 10 Commandments because you believe in the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You believe in the story of the Exodus. So when you read those words, I am God your Lord who brought you forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery, those words leap from the page to you because of your conviction that they speak God's truth. So of course, at your level, you embrace the 10 Commandments. But remember that the Noahide laws are, from our perspective, binding on all of humanity, not just on folks like you. And since most of humanity never heard of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, most of humanity doesn't know anything about the story of the Exodus, to expect the 10 Commandments to speak to them, to expect them to regard themselves as bound by the 10 Commandments is just not fair. It's based upon too many premises that aren't shared. The 7 Noahide laws make no such assumptions. Again, I reiterate, there isn't even any indication that the 7 Noahide laws include believing in God. If you ask, so what's their basis, if not belief in God? I would respond on a somewhat amorphous plane, because everyone can come to the conviction that there is some essential meaning in life, and that meaning imposes responsibilities. Granted, one who follows this track far enough down the road will necessarily, inevitably, come to God. But the stage of the 7 Noahide laws doesn't even presume that. It's much more basic than that. That, of course, was caveat number 1 in my response to Karl. The second is, I think, more directly relevant to our discussion, which is the 7 Noahide laws never were intended to serve as a ceiling. They're a floor. They're the foundation upon which one is, if anything, invited to build. The commandments of the Torah are not intended to remain exclusive and barred from the nations of the world. Indeed, as a case in point, we'll note that when the Holy Temple was standing here in Jerusalem, many non-Jews sent offerings to the Holy Temple to be brought upon the altar. And they were always brought. Because there was never any notion of the temple being exclusively our domain and off limits to non-Jewish offerings. So the offerings sent by non-Jews would be accepted graciously and offered upon the holy altar in the holy temple in the name of, on behalf of, the people who sent them. No question. In essence, of course, this is something that derives from verses in the Bible that we've already had occasion to discuss, but maybe it's worthwhile to review them also from time to time. In Kings 1, chapter 8, verses 41, 42, and 43. This is the prayer of consecration of the Holy Temple by King Solomon. And while tantalizingly in this prayer of consecration, he doesn't speak at all about bringing offerings to the temple, just not the issue. He speaks about praying to God via the temple. And in verse 41, he beseeches God, also the alien, who is not from your people Israel, who comes from a faraway land for the sake of your name, because they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and outstretched arm, and come and pray to this house, in this house, to God. You hear from the heavens, from the habitation of your indwelling, as it were, and do as all that the alien calls out to you, so that they will know, that all the peoples of the earth will know your name, to revere you like your people Israel, and to know that your name is called upon this house that I've built. Note, no exclusivity at all. On the contrary, whatever they ask, grant, because they need to learn about you, like your people Israel have learned about you, to revere you as Israel reveres you. Give them whatever they ask. And in a similar vein, as we've noted, regarding the rebuilt holy temple of the future, the words of Isaiah in chapter 56, verse 7, I shall bring them to my holy mountain and gladden them in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and peace offerings will be favored upon my altar, because my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. All peoples. This isn't about Israel. This is about all the nations. Ultimate inclusivity. Everyone is welcome. Indeed, the next verse. So says God the Lord, the ingatherer of the dispersed of Israel, I will yet ingather upon it many more. Not just about Israel. So again, then, to that extent, 7 Noahide Laws, baseline, not ceiling. Threshold, not rooftop. And indeed, to that extent, we certainly appreciate that, especially those peoples who believe in the Holy Bible, especially Christians, who therefore feel bidden to keep commandments in addition to the Noahide Laws, are certainly welcomed with open arms. So, of course, to that extent, when I speak of the Noahide Laws, it isn't in any way intended to minimize the significance of the additional dimensions that are fulfilled by people who believe in God's Word in the Bible. And yet, getting back, after all, to the question here about how we relate to Christianity and Islam, it is that basic threshold, the 7 Noahide laws, that determines whether we relate to people as living godly lives or not. And it's not so much the theology. It's, again, the deeds. So, to that extent, recognizing as we do that there are, of course, theological differences that express themselves in the context of reverence of God's Word revealed in the Bible, and many other ways as well. What is of crucial importance in characterizing people as godly is, do they act godly? I know I've made this point in the past, but it certainly demands being restated here. If a person has a godly theology, but godless deeds, we will not consider that person godly because of his theology. We will consider that person godless because of his deeds. If, for example, he engages in murder of innocent men, women, and children, or even supports the murder of innocent men, women, and children, clearly he is godless. And his theology, if it is a godly one, far from redeeming his godless acts, if anything, makes them even worse. Makes them even worse, first of all, because with a godly theology, he should have known better. After all, in our behavior toward the world around us, one of the Noahide laws is even the prevention of wanton cruelty to animals, all the more so to people. And besides that obvious consideration, he should have known better. By professing a godly theology and acting godlessly, besides the crime itself of the godless behavior, such a person is also profaning the holy name of God. When evil is perpetrated in the name of God, that is the ultimate profanation, desecration of God's name. So again, theology is well and good, but it doesn't take center stage. And of course, expressing myself as I just have now, on the one hand, we must concede. While all people who revere God are burdened with the responsibility of manifesting that godliness in deed and not just in thought, and we certainly decry any member of any religion, certainly including Jews and Christians, who act godlessly despite having a godly theology. And again, I reiterate, this is a problem that we have across the board. Still in all, let's be blunt. Today, in our day and age, Muslims have that problem to a far greater degree, because there are so many Muslims who engage in such grievous crimes against humanity, in the name of their religion. That's a problem. But simultaneously, of course, it's important for us to remember it isn't everyone. That is, I have certainly read statements by devout Muslims decrying such godless behavior. And I think we all know of, at the very least, some Muslim leaders, extraordinary individuals, courageous visionaries, who decry vocally such conduct on behalf of their co-religionists. And to that extent, I believe there are Muslims who are genuinely godly, not only in their beliefs, but also in their deeds. I may be accused of being naive. I don't think I'm being naive here. I think I'm being realistic. Maybe it's not such a terrible thing to be a little bit naive also. But again, I believe there are such individuals. The challenge is still, of course, inevitably, for their co-religionists who have not yet come on board that track to embrace not only godly beliefs, but godly actions. Until they do, again, one whose beliefs are godly and whose actions are godless is godless. The beliefs will not redeem. The actions are decisive. Of course, to that extent, in relating back to the question that we're addressing here, I concede that there are differences in practice in the world today between how we as Jews view adherents of Judaism, adherents of Christianity, and adherents of Islam. But again, I'm still going to reiterate, when we speak of the religion per se, the religion is not a problem. It's the individuals practicing it in a godless manner who are the problem. Now, that is still only addressing part of the question that was asked here. There was some additional elaboration that I didn't include in writing here, but that we certainly should address, because it's kind of included in this last line, is this the same God we revere? The question of whether Islam, despite its professed monotheism, derives from various pagan roots. I know this is a thesis that I have heard advanced in several quarters, actually all the time, by dear friends of mine who are Christians, that the roots of Islam are to be found in the pagan religion of Arabia that preceded the rise of Islam. I don't know very much about the history of religion in this regard. What I do feel compelled to share with you is, in our tradition, as recorded in the Talmud, and of course the Talmud was composed before the rise of Islam, the Talmud makes reference to a kind of idolatry that appears to have been extant at the time. The idolatry was called, in the language of the Talmud, markolis, and the way the pagan ritual was observed is by throwing stones at markolis. I'm merely sharing this observation with you. Any further commentary and elaboration, I leave to your imagination. Could be there is a connection here, but it's important for us to stress here. Does that connection really matter to us? From our perspective as Jews, the answer categorically is no, because If you ask any Muslim believer today, he will stridently repudiate any pagan beliefs, irrespective of whether they may have at some point in the past have underlied the religion many years ago. Muslims today are true monotheists, unequivocally, without debate. And to that extent, whereas in the mind of a pagan, serving a god is a god from among many, just consider as an obvious example the Roman Pantheon. If someone who believed in the gods of Rome were to venerate Jupiter, it certainly wouldn't have been because of viewing all the other gods as non-existent. They may have not been as strong, but they certainly weren't in any way dependent upon or derivative of the premier god of the Roman Pantheon. Muslims certainly do not believe anything of the sort, categorically. They believe there is only one God. They are true monotheists. And whether there was any earlier basis of the religion in some earlier form of paganism, to us, frankly, is irrelevant. Again, what you do now is what matters. To better illustrate this observation, I'd like to share with you an historical consideration. An historical consideration that goes back to the sources that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion this evening. I noted then that both Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi and Rabbi Moses Maimonides composed their works and their statements about Christianity and Islam during the 12th century. I think it is worthwhile for us to consider the context in which they expressed their words in this vein. And before I do, I'm apologizing, because while I have an agenda in mentioning what I'm about to mention, it's not what you think. And I'm certainly not sharing this with you in order to make anyone feel uncomfortable or awkward. But I feel compelled to note. 12th century. What immediately preceded it? 1096, 1097, the First Crusade. The First Crusade, before going to battle against the Muslim infidels, began in the Rhine Valley by going to battle against defenseless Jewish men, women, and children. The Crusaders sharpened their military skills on a defenseless civilian population, and the massacres were horrific. Wanton cruelty, unspeakable wickedness. At the end of which, of course, in much of the Rhine Valley, the communities that had been flourishing were no more. For the Crusaders, of course, it was merely the first installment in a battle plan that culminated in 1099 with the conquest of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem was conquered, like in the Rhine Valley, every Jewish man, woman, and child in the city was butchered. Now, mind you, the Crusaders also butchered the Muslims. And I'm not excusing one crime as less wicked than the other. But you know, the world at the time was sundered by the conflict between Christianity and Islam. The Jews weren't being butchered because they were the principal combatants. The Jews were merely accessories to be massacred. In bearing in mind this context, the background for both the words of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi and the words of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, we may discern all the more not only how courageous their stand, being so inclusive of Christianity and Islam, was, but how visionary. Because, of course, on the one hand, they too were observing a religion, Christianity, that on a number of planes, let's be honest with one another, derived from pagan roots. There are a number of ritual practices in Christianity that indeed had pagan origins, but it doesn't make Christianity into paganism. That is, to the extent that those rituals have been separated from their pagan origins, they no longer indict the religion. Furthermore, and even more glaringly, the repugnantly godless behavior of those people who were acting in the name of their religion, who were indeed murdering innocent people in the name of their religion, didn't prevent these sages from envisioning a different Christianity. Indeed, maybe it's not a different Christianity so much as simply different Christians, with the realization that even if their Christian contemporaries were acting in so godless a manner, that didn't mean that Christianity itself could not, in a different set of circumstances, with a different set of practitioners, serve as means to becoming godly, to advancing God's plan in the world. Again, to me, this seems not only an extraordinarily courageous statement, but an extraordinarily visionary one, to imagine a different world, and to recognize that the Christianity that they were viewing was not necessarily what Christianity would always remain. I'll note, simply as a matter of historical fact, that for much of the medieval period, ironically, Jews fared a lot better at the hands of Muslims than at the hands of Christians. That's not to imply that Muslims weren't butchering Jews as well, but in many instances to a much, much lesser degree. Obviously, we recognize that in our world today, the situation has changed. And in our world today, many Muslims cause many Jews and Christians much grief. But just as the rabbis of the 12th century were able to look past the Christianity that they saw, I suspect we need to look past the Islam that we see today. This is not, by any means, to let anyone off the hook. And I reiterate what I said earlier. When someone behaves godlessly, having a godly theology will be of no avail whatsoever. If anything, it compounds the indictment. But ultimately, we have to recognize this is a challenge. We need to place only one place in the hands of Muslims. Just as the rabbis of the 12th century didn't tell Christians what they should believe or how they should change their ways, because that was a growth process that had to take place within Christianity. So too today. We aren't going to be the ones to tell Muslims what to believe. We aren't going to be the ones to tell them how to practice their religion. There are, I reiterate, Muslims who are deeply troubled by the association that has been established by their co-religionists between Islam and godless violence. But this is something the Muslims are going to have to work out. As, thank God, many Christians, everyone here, has worked that out so magnificently. I realize, even today, we probably don't have all of Christendom on board. You folks are the beachhead, and we're confident that you'll bring everyone in your footsteps. And as you know, because I've mentioned this on any number of occasions, I regard this as an extraordinary miracle from God, that we are here together, studying His Word together, and striving to come closer to Him in different ways, but together. And I think it's important for us to affirm, if and when Muslims sort things out and are ready to join us, we will be here to welcome them with outstretched arms. Because the theology will not divide us unbridgeably, and once they have adopted that path of godliness that is, again, first and foremost, most essentially, about deed, we're looking forward to welcoming them with open arms. It's going to have to be something that comes from them, of course. And again, I reiterate, that responsibility remains in their hands. But there is nothing about Islam that will prevent us from being able to do so. Again, I'm citing as precedent. The rabbis of the 12th century weren't put off by the pagan roots of certain Christian practices, and they weren't even put off by the wanton godlessness of Christian practitioners. Because in the final analysis, Christianity and Islam can serve as means to bring man back to God. Of course, ultimately, man is still endowed by God with free will, which means actually doing so is up to us, up to each and every one of us. But we have the opportunity, and so do they. All humanity does. It's in our hands. All as part of the fulfillment of the words of Zephaniah, the prophet Zephaniah, chapter 3, verse 9. For then I shall change to clear language for peoples, for them all to call in God's name, to serve Him with one accord, shoulder to shoulder. I feel compelled to share with you, why am I specifically citing this biblical verse? Why not another verse from the Bible? I'll tell you, I'm not the one who cited it. Maimonides cited it. Maimonides cited that verse from Zephaniah as illustrating what Christianity and Islam have the wherewithal to advance in the world. And just look at the world of the 12th century in which he was writing. And look at us here today. Here in this video conference room together, fulfilling in our own small way the words of the prophet Zephaniah, to serve him with one accord, shoulder to shoulder, virtual shoulder to shoulder, but shoulder to shoulder nonetheless. We look forward again to Islam, Muslims joining us too. And there isn't anything that in principle is going to serve as an impediment to welcoming them on board once again they get their house in order. A house of godliness, not merely in thought, but in deed. As one final note, I feel compelled to make reference to what we discussed in our last questions and answers session, when, as you may recall, we discussed Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19. As we noted, the context there was the description of what we are to spurn as the basis of paganism. Verse 19 warns, lest you lift your eyes heavenward and see the sun and the moon and the stars, the whole host of the heavens, and become wayward and bow down to them and serve them that God your Lord dispensed to all the peoples beneath all the heavens. Remember the discussion. That's it. That all the nations are forced to make do with that indirect bond to God that is established via these various heavenly or celestial forces. And in a similar vein, as we also noted, the words of the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 10, verse 2, so says God, the way of the nations you shall not learn, and the signs of the heavens you shall not fear, because the nations fear them. The nations fear them, by implication, because the nations are subsumed within some natural order that makes them subject to the signs of the heavens, the vagaries of nature. You need not fear that. That was, again, the thrust of the verse in Jeremiah. I remind you, at the end of our discussion of these verses, I shared with you the comment of one of the foremost rabbinical scholars of roughly a century later, that is, the end part of the 13th century and into the beginning of the 14th century, Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, who states explicitly in his discussing these verses and their implications that this distinguishes Israel from the pagans, but not those nations that have circumscribed themselves, limited themselves with what he describes as the ways of religion. And in context, he is explicitly referring to the Christians in whose company he was living. He lived in Perpignan. And the emphatic point of emphasis in what he writes, and he writes this repeatedly and in manifold contexts, is once people become circumscribed by the ways of religion and abandon the vulgarities of paganism of the ancient world, they have as direct a bond to the Almighty as Israel. I'm stressing this point because this expression, circumscribing the ways of the religion, demands some explication. What does it mean? But of course, at this point, I think you could well imagine. Circumscribed by the ways of religion means, first and foremost, a universal moral code. Because it is, after all, that universal moral code that serves more than anything else as the basis of our doing God's bidding in perfecting this world that He has given us. He gave us a mission. He gave us all a mission. Again, as we express it in our prayers, to perfect the world under the reign of the Almighty, with the realization that Israel by itself does not accomplish that mission exhaustively. As Israel functions in the role, if you will, of heart, Christianity and Islam have functioned as the arteries in pumping this divine message to the entire world. And irrespective of the extent to which individual practitioners of the religion succeed or fail to do that today, the mission remains the same. The challenge remains the same. The potentiality of both Christianity and Islam remains the same. We await that potentiality's actualization. I just feel compelled to note, before we conclude, that I had intended, past tense, I had intended to address an additional question this evening, which we won't be able to accommodate because of the hour, but I'd like to, at the very least, read it to you, because given what we just noted, I think the question becomes, if anything, more burning. Why is it that Jews don't seem to be as committed as Christians to bringing the Word of God to all the people of the world? Have Jews ever done missionary work as Christian missionaries have? Isn't the Word of God for everyone? Strong questions. And again, I reiterate, questions that become, if anything, more burning in light of what we stated about the goal. It is, after all, to restore the entire world to God. So, of course, inevitably, we're still going to have to address this question and consider, in that broader arena, what God expects of each of us and ultimately has in store for all of us. You may well imagine why I had hoped that we would be able to accommodate this question this evening as well. God willing, we'll continue with it next time. But for now, if we could distill from all of the foregoing one crucial bottom line, again, with respect to relating to Christianity and Islam as means for acquainting the world with the one God. Indeed, they both function as means ordained by God. They are here for that purpose. But as for each and every individual needs to make him and herself worthy of that ultimate God-given purpose. To be godly in thought and deed, in belief and action. And by so doing, to make this world, all of it, a much more godly place. We've got a lot of work to do. God bless you.